Other Beethoven Opus 18 number 1, and that also was in the development section. So binary form is a form which is associated with dance movements. As I mentioned, it's really important in the fact that it is the basis then for sonata form, sonata allegro form. That becomes such an important structural formula in the classical era. So sonata allegro form develops in the classical period. So you don't really have sonata allegro in the Baroque, but you do have binary form in the Baroque, which then is basically, the essence of what then will be elaborated into the bigger, more complicated, complex sonata allegro structure. All right, recitative, I mentioned that in connection to the Franck, the third movement of the Franck violin sonata. He indicated that movement was recitative fantasy. So recitative, if you just know that that's typically featuring a solo line, so unaccompanied, so either no accompaniment at all, is what we see, a lot of times when it's used in an instrumental context. But it then is something which is speech-like and is something which has that dramatic kind of element to it. So I mentioned the fact that recitatives would basically they were associated with operas, and they would be the section that would express the dramatic element at that particular point in the opera, in the scene. So that was used in that third movement of the violin sonata. So it was a real dramatic element in that work. All right, so the term fantasy has to do with something that has more of an improvisatory characteristic, and something that is more intuitive rather than following a preconceived form. And so that's an important general type of work in the common practice period. The term Rococo is a term that is used in France to denote the galant style there. It was maybe a little more ornamented than the Italian galant, but it's the same basic era. You think of someone like Francois Couperin and Rameau as being composers who were writing during that era. So that's one of the pre-classical eras. So just think of that as a type of galant music. And then these last two terms for the definitions, augmentation and diminution, both have to do with rhythmic development techniques. We talked about these in connection with the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. But augmentation is taking a melody and presenting it in longer note values than you hear it initially. Whereas diminution is something that is doing just the opposite, taking a theme, melody, and presenting it in shorter note values. So, all right, I mentioned already galant and Empfindsamer basic compositional characteristics of Corelli I mentioned. Then with Franck, you want to know that Franck is, a Belgian composer, but is someone who was trained at the Paris Conservatory, and he's someone who's a very, outstanding student there. He's associated with the organ, so he's an organist. He's very influenced by J.S. Bach, especially Bach's, polyphonic style. But also you want to mention something about harmonic chromaticism, that Franck's music is very chromatic, And so lots and lots of altered tones, lots of accidentals in the music. That always gives a very expressive effect. And it's something that by the end of the 19th century becomes really popular. And it's a style that is associated with Richard Wagner in the middle part and a little after, in the second half of the 19th century. But that's important in Franck's music. Also the idea of cyclic construction. So I already mentioned that here in this review, that idea of the cyclic return of the A theme from the first movement of the violin sonata. He also uses extended harmonies, using ninth chords and 11th chords. And so that's something, too, that is happening harmonically at the end of the Romantic period. So then what do we have here? Emperor Quartet, I mentioned that. Razumovsky, I mentioned that already. You should know a little bit about just the Cremona luthiers, and so that would be Amati and Stradivari, Guarneri, and how they really developed the modern violin family and built instruments that have been unsurpassed in quality and design. In fact, their designs are still used as the models of perfection for all later luthiers, all later instrument builders who are making string instruments. So I mentioned the term sonata, so that just it means to sound. I've mentioned that. Let's see, what else have I not talked about? Okay, rounded binary in sonata allegro form, basically rounded binary has the idea of a restatement of the beginning of the movement. So that is a two-part form with double bars and repeats around two sections, but it just uses one theme. Sonata allegro form typically is associated with two themes in the opening part, the exposition. So rounded binary has the same basic overall harmonic construction of tonic to dominant in the first half. In the second half is dominant to tonic. Rounded binary, when it returns to tonic in the second half, that's where you have that restatement of a little bit of the opening. But with sonata allegro form, then it's much expanded, so it's longer, and you have that contrasting B theme. You just have more development in the beginning of the second half, and a return then of both themes in the recapitulation. So those are basic, it's a basic comparison there. The way that Haydn uses theme and variation in his second movement of Opus 76, number 3, if you'll remember, it's 4 variations, and each member of the quartet has a variation in which they play the theme, and the other members of the quartet then decorate the theme. And so I use the term heterophony, which is used to describe that texture of a single melody that appears with an accompanied version of itself in another instrument. And so that's a good example of heterophony. So that's why there are 4 variations, because each variation has a different instrument playing the theme. In looking at the 2 movements from the Beethoven string quartets, in general, you want to look at the proportions of the movements. So in 18 number 1, the development is the shortest section, which is typical of a classical work, of a classical sonata allegro movement, such as one by Mozart or Haydn. And so it's more classical in that sense. Also uses double bars and repeats around the exposition. And we'll see then that Opus 59 number 1 is a middle period work where he's starting to experiment and kind of tinker with the forms and experimenting with the idea of not having repeats around the exposition and expanding the length of the development section, but also the coda section. And so Beethoven's codas, even in the early works, those could be long as well. I mean, he always liked to continue to develop his ideas and wanted to, bring forth everything possible with his themes. But those ideas of just kind of changing the basic proportions of the section, that's more romantic, and discarding double bars around the exposition. You'll see that in many of his later works. So I mentioned the organizational factor in the Franck Sonata is the cyclic principle. And then you have something here about thematic manipulations and relationships in the Brahms Sonata. So I already mentioned that, that they both discard the double bars and repeats around the exposition, and that they both have that emphasis on motivic thematic development. So one of the things that you'll want to do is to go over those charts that compare Baroque and classical, and then also classical and romantic, so that you can talk about musical style. You'll have an essay example like what you did on the concerto exam, and I want you to describe what you see and hear using appropriate terminology. So for instance, when you talk about melody, you're talking about things such as conjunct or disjunct, a narrow range or more extended range. Phrasing has to do with whether it's in irregular, recurring patterns of 4-measure lengths, or harmonic features. That you always want to talk about, whether something is primarily diatonic or if it is more chromatic. Sometimes you can have, of course, melodic chromaticism, where you have, chromatic melodies that are fitting within diatonic chord progressions. So Mozart was really a famous example of that. But those are the two main terms. You also could talk about something like harmonic rhythm, the rate of change of the harmony. That's always appropriate to talk about. Texture, the main texture terms are going to be homophonic and polyphonic. You can use the term monophonic in situations where it's a single voice. I mentioned that one term, heterophonic. That's a real specific, more, specific kind of situation that you don't find as much in Western music. And with form, in general, you're going to look for forms in chamber music that are similar to the forms that you had with the symphony, because I mentioned the fact that the string quartet develops in a parallel manner to the symphony. Same number of movements and tempi and forms with each movement. In the Baroque, the dance movements, binary form, and all of that, those are the main forms that you're going to be looking for in the piece that you're going to talk about. Rhythmic features have to do with anything that has to do with irregular, patterns like syncopation or cross rhythms, more complicated rhythms. Romantic composers could use 13 notes in one hand of a piano work and 4 notes in the left hand. That's more complicated, obviously. If something is more straightforward, and maintaining a steady pulse, that's something that's more classical. If it's something that is more flexible and more pushing and pulling of the basic pulse, that tempo rubato style is one which is more romantic. You can always look at performance indications. You can see whether or not there are a lot of things written into the score. In general, the as the common practice period progresses, composers write more and more into the music, and they are wanting to control the way that their music is expressed. There's a lot more improvisation in the Baroque as compared to the Romantic period. But that's one thing that you can look for to see how explicit the composer is as far as indications to the performer and as how they want it performed. And then the overall basic philosophy of emotional content being the primary element that the composer is conveying as compared to something that's more reserved and that sense of self-imposed restraint, which is the typical classical slow movement mood. But you can make some kind of comment about that as well. So look at those charts and have specific terminology that you can use. One final thing that is listed here on the review questions is just look at that page 51 chart that is on the text tab, and that is one which lists standard instrumentation for specific groups. So if you have two violins, viola, and cello, that's a string quartet. That's the standard classical string quartet. Or if you have viola, cello, and piano, that is called a piano trio, and so forth. So look that over so that you can use that term in describing the instrumentation of the work. So I will give you something that is one of those types of standard chamber ensembles that's listed on that page. Okay, so study hard, and we will see you here for the next test.